Hello and welcome. My name is Terry Meir, and I'm so glad to host this class to help join us with our ecosystem. These free classes are a gift to the community in order to help us all connect in this time of COVID and remember what connection feels like. So it's really wonderful today to be talking about the inner landscape, which in my opinion is one of the most important aspects of permaculture and often overlooked. Today we have an amazing expert and one of my favorite people on the planet, Roman Hanis from Peru. He actually helped co-found the PITT Institute over 20 years ago and works with the indigenous people down there for connection, healing, and spiritual awakening. So I'm very happy to have Roman here today to talk about the inner landscape with us. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Terry. It's wonderful to be here. Wonderful to connect with everyone. It's always a joy to work with Terry and just connected with Amy. And I really love the initiative that you guys have. And we are here in Peru. As Terry mentioned, I'm a co-founder of the PITT Institute for the Preservation of Ecology and Indigenous Culture. And I have been working with the inner landscape part. My wife, who is also co-founder of the Institute, she's actually the permaculture expert. And I've learned a lot from her over the years, and also from a lot of amazing teachers like Terry, and also another one of our core permaculture teachers at the Institute is Andrew Jones, who has an amazing Baja Biosana in Mexico. And also another teacher of ours is Greg Landoa, who is working in Ecuador, and they have an amazing cacao farm. Our institute, we have a 4,000-acre reserve, which is a watershed, an essential watershed for the Amazon rainforest. And we are the last frontier of civilization. Behind our mountain are some of the last uncontacted tribes in the world, and we are in the buffer zone for one of the major national reserves in Peru. It's called the Manu National Reserve, and it's beautiful to live there and work with the local people and see how they interact with the environment, and see how those ancient principles are continuing to be applied today. And of course, it starts within. It starts in the culture itself, how people are engaging with each other, with themselves, and with the environment. And this is the principle by which our institute has been founded, this connection between the inner and outer landscape, which is an inexorable connection. That's the way that humanity has lived throughout most of its existence. And this is the way of life that allowed human culture to evolve and get to the point where we are now. And this is the point where it's essential to remember what brought us to this point. And if we don't remember, then it can bring all kinds of issues like we are experiencing in the world today, both on the level of individual health, collective health, and of course the health of the planet. So to start the class today, I'll just make a little overview of the permaculture principles. And we can see how the permaculture principles in the permaculture design manual have been implemented by Bill Mollison based on his own life experience. And of course, what he has learned from many different ancient cultures himself, like the Aborigines in Australia, and he also implemented elements from the Tibetan culture and many other cultures in the world, including the Amazonian and the Indian cultures. They have been implementing those principles since the very beginning of those cultures and traditions. So you can see how all of those principles, like the care of the planet, the care of the people, so those are all principles that are very essential to human existence. And of course, this whole system that we are operating in, which is the planet Earth and all of the organisms. So this is not separate. We're all part of our environment, and the environment is part of us. Even when astronauts go to space, they take a miniature version of the ecosystem with them. They cannot survive without oxygen, they cannot survive without food. And so this is something that we have to consider, that we are not separate from the environment that we live in. And the environment is not separate from us on many, many different levels. So those principles, observe and interact. Observe and interact is the first principle by which the indigenous people also work and live with. And this is something that we found to be essential in our organization as well, because observation is an art. It has many different layers to it. And the more that we learn how to observe, how to be receptive, the more objectively we can engage with our life, with our environment, with the challenges that are coming up, and apply solutions to that, right? Another essential permaculture principle is the problem is the solution. And the solution is essentially found within the problem. The indigenous people, they say that the excessive comfort makes us weak. If there are no problems in our lives that we have to engage with and apply ourselves to, then we cannot evolve. We cannot engage with our inner potential and discover it in that way. So that is an essential principle in permaculture that everything starts with. So of course, we have to begin with our center. As Terry mentioned, it's the 0.00 zone that we have to begin with. And for the indigenous people, they have always acted from this place where it's essential to recognize the emotional, the mental, the spiritual components of our lives and see how the nature outside of us is always reflecting the nature within us. For the different ancient cultures, I also work with the principles of Chinese medicine. And in ancient Chinese medicine, they would say that there is no outer evil without an inner disbalance first. And for the indigenous people, this there is a very fine line where I end and the world begins. And so it's essential to recognize, well, how my own organism is functioning and how nature is an organism that one's own organism is an essential and inherent aspect of. And so then, of course, if there is an inner conflict, if there is a certain disconnect and inability to engage with all aspects of one's life, then that will spill out into the collective and into the environment that we live in. So in the society that we are living in today, there is a lot of separation and discord, and the principles are not really based on regenerative approach or sustainable approach. And that starts from within. If I live my life in a way that is not sustainable, and I engage in my life in that way, and I'm separate from the environment, from the people, and I live more based on self-gratification that is not supporting the organism that I am responsible for myself, then of course, how can I engage with the greater organism as well? So this is a very important principle, and then from there, we can see the other principles that begin to evolve from. Another principle is catch and store energy. So energy is an essential principle in permaculture, and there are many different levels of transformation of that energy. How that energy can begin with sunlight and water, and how that energy begins with the seeds of life. And then that energy has to actually go through this process of transformation. There's this alchemical process that we can witness in nature, the photosynthesis, that is also applied within ourselves. And we can see it in the language of the indigenous people. The language is a very poetic language. It's a language that is filled with metaphors. And this language is always connecting the inner and outer landscapes. The indigenous people, they speak about the seed of love within us that we are all born from. And then in order for us to sprout that seed in our lives, then we have to consider the environment that we live in. We have to consider the Mother Earth, which is the symbol of unconditional love. She is always supporting. She provides the fertile soil for us to plant that seed in. And if our seed is not able to find that fertile soil, then we can see that most seeds have a very hard shell around them to protect them against the harsh circumstances until they find that fertile soil where they can actually release that hard shell and blossom. So we all have that innocence, that openness, that beginner's mind within us that can only sprout when there are conditions that surrounding us that encourage that. And those conditions, of course, relate to the tribe, the intentional community, the people who have the same intention, the same purpose in life. And then we learn how to engage with each other and really find that fertile soil. Of course, the fertile soil relates to this ability to actually integrate all of the elements. So there's the nourishment, there's the water, there's the sunlight, there are the micronutrients and the different life forms that are necessary for that fertile soil. And so the chi, the prana, the life energy is something that is also central to many ancient cultures, if not all of them. And in the indigenous cultures and traditions here in the Amazon and the Andes, the people and all life forms are referred to as the channels of energy. So we are the children of the Mother Earth and the Father Sun. The Mother Earth relates to the universal unconditional love, and the Father Sun to the impartial light of consciousness that continues to discover the depth of unconditional love in our lives. The water, the indigenous people, they live in this animistic way where all of the elements, they relate to certain aspects of our inner universe. The water, for example, is related to this discerning, intuitive wisdom of the Great Mother. The water tends to adapt and it tends to take in the energy, the certain elements of whatever it comes in touch with, and then works with that. So all of those aspects, they are essential, and for the indigenous people, they see it in this way where it relates to self-awareness. How can we build empowering and energizing relationships? How can we catch that energy and work with it? So for the indigenous people, for example, here in the Andes, they had this very intricate aqueduct systems where they would allow the water to come down the mountain and nourish their crops and feed their livestock and go through all kinds of filtering mechanisms and allow then people to have water to drink and also have water for daily functions and to wash themselves. And so that's one of the ways how water would go through so many different stages and be useful at each one of them. And then, of course, the same thing with our own organism. So the water goes through our organism. And for the indigenous people, the water was related to as the greatest, this pure love of the mother. It starts at the top of the mountain. The indigenous people, they call it the Halpa Mama, the highest mama, and it's this pure energy of life, this energy of passion, of connection, of interconnectedness that allows us to relate to each other. And then the water goes through all of those energy centers in ourselves. and then expresses itself uniquely at each one of them. And for the indigenous people is the creative force, the creative element, the water of love, the water of light. When you see the water coming down the mountain, the indigenous people, they see that it's this waterfall, and its color is white when it comes down the mountain. It's this kind of gushing waterfall. And the indigenous people, they talk about it as the milk of the great mother that comes down and nourishes life in that way. And there are great celebrations and holidays in that regard. And then, of course, that's another very big part of the indigenous culture, is to celebrate life and to come together around the celebration. The indigenous people, because they worked in community, because they worked with this relatedness, the unity of diversity, which is another principle of permaculture, this collaboration rather than competition. And for the indigenous people, that way of life actually allowed them to be in celebration mode for more than half a year. So here in this culture, every other day is a holiday. And that comes from ancient times, where people lived in community, they worked together, they were able to accomplish a lot more than we are capable of today when we work in this separate way. And then they had more than half a year to enjoy and celebrate life and live together, and really do this as a prayer, the celebration as a prayer. In our institute, we cultivate this principle where work, play, and pray are inseparable from each other. And that's how the ancients lived their lives. So there's definitely a lot that we can learn from them in that regard. And it also relates to this transformation of life, where we work, we put an effort, but it doesn't have to be a struggle. The responsibility that we take for our lives and for our close ones, it can be a joyful responsibility. It's not always pleasant, but because we see this greater meaning and purpose, then that becomes very meaningful and beneficial. So this is something that is worth reflecting on, because life is meant to be enjoyed. If it's an obligation, if it's disempowering, even if I do it with this idea that I do it for the sake of everyone, then often it becomes actually more of a problem than something that is of benefit. So there has to be this passion, this joy and inspiration that is supported by the greater meaning and purpose in our lives. So that's also part of the catching and storing energy. There is this energy of love that is surrounding us. And for the indigenous people, they say that if love is made conscious, then it becomes creative. But if love is unconscious, then it becomes destructive. And that relates to another principle of permaculture, which is make no waste. In nature, there is no waste. So if I'm not conscious of the emotions and the feelings and the surrounding circumstances of my life, if I'm not able to see how the dots are connected, how everything is working together, then I'm not able to support that greater organism. And then what happens as a result of that? Then I become a compost for something more meaningful to happen. But if I can support it, then I become in service to the greater organism, and I am supported in that way. And then nature is actually able to continue working through me in a way that I can be useful. So that's an essential principle that the indigenous people also worked with, where everything is love, and it can be either creative or destructive based on the consciousness that we bring to it. And then it becomes something that is in conscious service or unconscious service. But the service is still happening no matter what. We're always a part of this greater organism. So that is also this principle of love that has to be made conscious, is this union of the Mother Earth and the Father Sun. And those are the complementary opposites in nature that are within each one of us. And so this inner balance that is brought together so that everything can function, so that everything can actually be brought into this meaningful unity of diversity. Another principle, of course, is the application of self-regulation and accepting feedback. So on the inner level, there has to be this ability to be honest with oneself, to be transparent, to cultivate the beginner's mind, and also to learn how to give and receive simultaneously. For the indigenous people, this principle relates to this truth of life as they work with it, which is giving is receiving and receiving is giving. So if all I do is just think that I have a lot to give and I'm constantly imposing, then I'm not giving everyone else an opportunity to share their gifts. And so when I can receive the wisdom of others, I'm actually giving in that way. If I can recognize this innocence of life, again, the vulnerability, the beginner's mind, and be vulnerable in that way, then I'm actually allowing everyone else to share. And there's a great amount of learning from that. And in this principle, applying self-regulation, accepting feedback, the indigenous people work with it as self-parenting in a way. So again, recognizing the Mother Earth as this principle of the Great Mother, that she's constantly reminding us of that unconditional love within ourselves, that capacity to give selflessly. She constantly supports us, provides for us, nourishes us no matter what. And so this is the ability that we also have within us, but we have to learn that ability. Then, of course, there's that impartial light of consciousness that is constantly shining no matter what, and is shining into places where it's something that is maybe not as pleasant to see within ourselves. And in that way, then we can constantly learn how to open our heart to greater challenges in our lives, how to face our shadows, how to face our fears. For the indigenous people, they see themselves as children, no matter how old they get. It's like continuously learning, continuously evolving. There's never a point where, okay, I know everything and everything is figured out. There's always this awe and curiosity and this sense of wonder that is maintained throughout life. And that is something that is very essential for the indigenous people, how to really cultivate that approach and not to forget it, and not to get locked into this rigid personality where it's not possible to adapt to continuously changing experiences of life. Life is always changing. That's something that we can be sure of. If there's something that is not changing, is the fact that everything is changing. And so then it's important to stay flexible. In nature, if there is this rigidity, then it means that it's close to dying. If there is flexibility and suppleness, then this is something that is related to the childlike nature and life itself. So this is wisdom. For the indigenous people, the wisdom is not when my head is full of concepts, like a watermelon, and the heart is like a peanut, that seed that has never sprouted. But the real wisdom is how to maintain that openness, that receptivity, vulnerability, the curiosity. It's a big one. There are many layers of meaning to life. And the indigenous people, they see that we are living in this great mystery. And the point of life is not to fully understand that mystery, but to understand it just enough to trust in it. It's this mystery of love, the mystery of the heart, and to be a part of that mystery, to recognize that each of us is a mystery as well. And then we can continuously discover our own capacity and potential to embody that mystery of the heart. So that's also very essential. And the self-regulation in that way, the self-discipline, and this ability to acknowledge and embrace our shadow is something that has to do with creating fertile soil in our lives. If we don't embrace our problems, if we don't embrace the parts of ourselves that we don't like, then we cannot have the motivation to really connect with each other. If I haven't had enough time to really develop kindness and compassion for my own issues, then I'm not able to do it with others. And then I cannot have kindness and tolerance and relatedness, patience, and all of those qualities that are so essential for us to work together towards a better world. So that's an essential principle of permaculture, and also many ancient traditions where there is this spiritual discipline. At first, I came to the Amazon rainforest 20 years ago, and I thought to myself that, yeah, indigenous people, they just do whatever, and they're just totally wild and running around, and don't have any point in that. But actually, I've never met more disciplined people in my life, where they really work together and they live in very harsh circumstances at times. And at the same time, they really have this very profound discipline, which relates to the discipline that is inner discipline. It's not so much about waking up at 5 in the morning and taking a cold shower. It's not a military kind of discipline, but is the discipline that comes from the willingness to be a human being under all circumstances, and to work together, and to engage with one's own parenting in a way. So that is very essential in these traditions. So some of the other principles I mentioned, producing no waste. Another principle is design that comes from patterns and into details. And this also has to do with the art of observation, how we can see the patterns of life. Nature communicates to us through patterns. And without us being receptive to those patterns, we cannot really engage with our inner discipline. So the first thing to do in our inner self-parenting, in us cultivating that fertile soil of our lives. There's the saying in Buddhism, no mud, no lotus. Thich Nhat Hanh was the one that coined that phrase. So in order for us to do that, we have to understand what is happening first. And many people today, they talk about the love and light and how special we all are and how great we are, and think that that's all it takes. But in these traditions, it's essential to really get our hands dirty in the mud, to really engage with all the issues of our lives, to understand the workings of our conditioning, what is not working and why it's not working in our lives. And only when we can understand that and we can see the patterns, then we can start changing that. It's this art of no resistance. I want to just throw away and make waste out of everything that I don't like, and then just grab onto what I like and only be with that. But the more I do that, the more it doesn't work, right? I keep trying to do the same thing, expecting a different result. So it's essential to observe before interacting. That is a very essential principle for the indigenous people, to understand the workings of conditioning. And of course, I see the patterns, and through those patterns, I see how all of the negative habits in our lives, it's not that they are this one solid habit, but it's based on many patterns and many causes that create that effect. It's not solid. And it relates to this also principle of diversity in nature. And the more that I can see and understand that, the more I can change it. It's like this many ingredients that are necessary, and you take away one of the ingredients, and then all of those negative habits start to fall apart. And the same thing, of course, with implementing the positive results. There have to be all of those elements to it. Our permaculture teacher, Greg Landua, he wrote this book about let me remember the name of it. It's this, I'll remember it later, but the book relates to the different sources of capital in our lives. So there are many different sources of capital. It's not just the financial capital, but the capital starts, of course, with the inner resourcefulness, getting to know oneself well enough to see what are the qualities, what are the gifts that I can contribute to the greater whole, and then recognizing the gifts that others have to contribute, and honoring that in each other, recognizing the capital that is in the soil, the capital that is in the seed, the capital that is within one's community, and the capital that is within other communities, that relates to different gifts and talents and qualities and skills. And those are all different forms of capital. I think the book is called 8 Forms of Capital, something like that. I'll remember it, and I'll send a link to it. So that is all very essential, because it all is part of the patterns that we can implement in our own life and into the greater whole. So the patterns, of course, there are so many different levels of it. So there are the patterns of community and change, as I mentioned. There are the patterns of the neurolinguistic programming, the language that we are using in our lives, the triggers of reaction that we have, and how one is leading to another, and how we can transform that. The indigenous people, they work a lot with this language of metaphors, as I mentioned. And so there are all of those patterns as well. I mentioned in the beginning how there's no outer evil without inner disbalance first. So those are all patterns for the indigenous people. If they see that something is happening in the outer environment, first and foremost, it has to do with the inner process. So they see, okay, what is happening on the level of our community? What is happening on our inner level? Where are we not engaging with the lessons that are coming in, to the point where those lessons keep getting louder? So for the indigenous people, nature is an organism, is a conscious organism, and we are a part of that organism. And the energy that is streaming through that organism is expressing itself differently on different levels of our being. And so then we start to recognize, okay, something is happening. Maybe this year we don't have a crop, and there are all kinds of natural disasters. Now, what does that mean on the level of our inner being? What are the issues in our lives that we are ignoring? Where is that harvest, those insights, the lessons, the evolutionary development that we are not engaging in? And then, of course, if we are ignoring something, ignorance, that is the cause of suffering. So what are we ignoring? And for the indigenous people, they live in this way where they see nature as something they personify it. They say, okay, if Mother Nature had a face, what would that face look like? If Mother Nature had a personality, what would that personality be like? And then what we can learn from that. How we can actually educate our own personality from the personality of nature. And nature is continuously communicating to us. There is nothing random for the indigenous people. Everything that is happening has this evolutionary purpose and insight. And the communication is always about the same thing. How can each one of us become a more integral element of the greater whole, not separate from it? How can we tap into the shared heart of existence and channel it through our being? How can we be more meaningful channels of that unconditional love in our lives, starting from within and then expanding it outward? And when we are not listening to that communication, when we are not taking it in, then the communication gets louder and louder and starts to take more and more physical form. And then we can relate to the different illnesses that we have. And I saw actually a very insightful article by some scientists who, through scientific work, have shown how even the different health issues and this epidemic that is happening in the world today is a result of our disconnect from our environment, is a result of our disconnect from each other, this lack of integration of diversity in our lives, and taking into account all of the different world cultures and the developing countries and the developed countries, and how, because we are not really working together, then the planet, the nature is now needing to actually bring about all of those different viruses and things like that as a wake-up call for us to remember what life is all about. And this is so essential. Here in Peru, we have our dear elders, the Cairo nation, and the Cairos, they have lived isolated. They were able to escape the conquest, and they lived and were able to maintain their heritage until very recently. So our Cairo Elders, they are the first generation that came down from the Ausangate mountain, and they are still able to share their culture and heritage intact. And that's what they share. They share it for all of humanity today, because they are the carriers of this ancient wisdom, and they see humanity as their, in a way, younger brothers and sisters that have forgotten the meaning, that have forgotten themselves as the children of those universal parents, and they see that our humanity today are kind of like orphans, that we have become disconnected from the world. So this is very essential for the indigenous people to always recognize what the universal parents are here continuously teaching us, continuously sharing with us about, and to recognize those wake-up calls, not to see things as random. Because if we see everything as random, then we are very disempowered, and we are forced to implement solutions that just bring more detriment, like pesticides and chemical fertilizers, and then that just keeps depleting the soil and creates less and less harvest in our lives. But if we really take into account the greater organism, then we are able to recognize those patterns and actually change them, and work with the art of no resistance, where the energy is directed and geared instead of blocked and suppressed. So that brings us into another aspect, integrate rather than segregate. So how can we really connect everything together? How can we connect the light and the shadow? How can we connect the fire and the water, which are all essential for the alchemical process of our life to take place? And so this alchemical process, again, is this ability for us to really capture and transform energy. So we have all of the ingredients in our lives for the perfect recipe to take place. Right now, with all of the issues, all of the problems in our lives, all of the challenges, all of the blessings, everything is needed and useful. And that includes also, of course, all of the people in our lives. Some people are challenging, some people are inspiring, but without the challenging people in my life, I wouldn't learn what it means to be more patient, what it means to be more generous, more kind, more tolerant. Without the inspiring people, I wouldn't know how to do it. So everyone are useful in that way. There is nothing that is outside of that. And in my life, I've learned living in community and really wishing to make a positive impact and change in the world. This is so essential to live in that way, not to forget that. And in permaculture, where permaculture is not just agriculture, right? It's a way of life. Our permaculture teacher Andrew Jones, who worked in Greening the Desert project in Saudi Arabia, and many other projects where large scopes of people were necessary to make a change. He worked in the Haiti project after that disaster that has happened years ago, and he was appointed as the by the United Nations as the director of the refugee camp, where they implemented the permaculture project to support 40,000 people after that huge disaster. And of course, working with immense amounts of people, one has to implement those principles on the level of interaction, on the level of really engaging with the community. And in order for us to really implement this change on the vast scale of the world, we need to learn how to work together, how to have social skills, and not just go by some different like self-righteousness and just fight with everyone who doesn't have the same idea or the same ideology, but how can we really find the middle ground? And so we have to learn how to interact, how to engage with each other, and really see that, yeah, everyone may have different ideas and it's not wrong. That's another essential principle for the indigenous people. There is no good and bad. There is no right and wrong. Instead, there is ignorance and there is wisdom, but they're not opposed to each other. Ignorance is an essential step towards wisdom if it's embraced. But if we make something bad, it can never be good. Then they are opposed. For the indigenous people, there is no good and bad energy. There's heavy energy. In Quechua, they call it hucha. And then there is the light energy, which they call sami. But the heavy energy is necessary for it to transform into light energy. And so everyone have their truth. It's not wrong. And then of course there is more objective truth and there is more subjective truth. The objective truth will include the subjective truth in itself. So this is part of that personality of Mother Nature, that she is not denying anything. She is all-encompassing and yet not bound by any of her elements. And how can we implement that? in our own life, in our own perspective and approach, so that we can really integrate it into the greater community and into the way that we communicate and share with each other. And of course, it's a serious discipline in that way. It sounds maybe more easy than it is in real life. And even if the community is very like-hearted and everyone have the same ideal and the same purpose, conflicts will still arise. And so then the point of how the indigenous people approach it is that the conflict itself can be the creative friction that allows us to evolve and unfold and see how the energy is transformed and make greater purpose and find that deeper meaning in our lives. So those are all very essential elements that allow us to really engage with the diversity of our life, and that diversity is requiring an open mind. How can we cultivate that openness? How can we recognize the diversity within our own being, acknowledging all the many different spiritual pathways and heritage in a very practical way? The indigenous people, they have this earth-based spirituality. It has to be practical. It's not just visualizing some figures of light, but really bringing the light into the shadow. And it's very essential to do it in that way. And then, of course, small and slow solutions. That's another principle of permaculture. That it's really the little things in our life that create the snowball effect, whether it happens on the level of the detrimental habitual patterns, or whether it's happening as healthy habits that we are implementing in our lives. If we just wait for the big thing to happen, then when it happens, in a moment of crisis, we don't rise to the level of our expectations, but we drop to the level of our preparedness. And I find that to be very true in my own life. And so instead of just having this wishful thinking that when the crisis happens, then I'll be able to manage, and that's when I'll start practicing. So it will not happen in that way. When the crisis hits and there's this big humanure storm, so to speak, then it's very hard if there has not been healthy habits cultivated to really deal with that. So it's essential to really engage with the little things, to find every little opportunity to really recognize those patterns and to transform them, to change them in our lives. So it's like every little thing in our lives, and how can we make that meaningful and useful so that we can keep engaging, and then of course preparing for the big crisis when it does happen. So we have certain experience developed. So that's very essential. Another part of it, I already mentioned, the celebration of life. For the indigenous people also, the journey is the destination. If we just kind of strive towards this bright future, but we are not able to really enjoy the journey towards it, then we get very disempowered, or I get very disempowered. I can take accountability for that. So then finding a way to really enjoy the little things in life, not just to wait for the big thing to be happy. For the indigenous people is this principle of being before doing, where in our modern society often it's doing before being. First I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to be happy. First I'm going to accomplish that, and then happiness never comes. So then for the indigenous people, first learning how to be happy, and then I can do everything else. But it's this seed of love, is this seed of well-being that has to be nurtured first and foremost. And then whatever that seed is brought into, in our lives, then that will make a difference. But if I'm disturbed and irritated, and then whatever I approach, it will be falling apart in my hands, even if my intention is good. Right? It says this road to hell is paved with good intentions. So, then how can we really engage with it in that way and apply ourselves so that we can actually share that seed of well-being and plant it in all circumstances in our lives? So that is very essential. So then valuing diversity in that way. So when we bring that seed of well-being, that openness and restfulness into whatever experience that we are engaging with, then we are able to see many different perspectives in those circumstances. And of course, then recognizing that we can see the diversity of the ecosystem, how the ecosystem needs all of those different facets of it, how nothing is possible without everyone. And nobody can help everyone, but everyone can help someone. And so for that, it's essential to be at ease, to be open. One of the essential principles that we learned from the indigenous people is that everything is perfect with infinite room for improvement. Right? So, but it's that attitude, because otherwise there are those two extremes. On one level of that extreme is this kind of obsessive compulsive tendency where I'm seeing everything wrong and I constantly need to fix everything, and that's not really beneficial or inspiring to anyone. And another tendency is where it's just this ignoring. Okay, like it's not my responsibility, I don't need to deal with it, and who cares, and everything is perfect anyway. But where there is this middle ground, everything is perfect with infinite room for improvement. And then there is this joy, there is the inspiration to keep engaging, to keep nourishing and supporting, and then of course the energy can keep evolving and growing from that. It's not interrupted, it's not abandoned, but there is this succession that is taking place, and nature is working with that. In nature, everything is continuously flowing and transforming. The energy is continuously evolving in that way when it's not interrupted. It's this art of no resistance. Instead of resisting the energy, this uncontainable life force, then it's embraced and guided in a way that it can be the most beneficial. So that's another essential element. Then, of course, another principle is the edge, right? Engaging with the edges where the diversity is the greatest. Our center, our reserve, for example, is on the edge. It's this edge where the mountains meet the rainforest. And the edge is where the most diversity of life is found. So in our center, we have the subtropical climate. We actually have 3 climate zones because of that edge, where we have the high Sierra climate on top of our land. We have temperate zone in the middle of our land, and we have the subtropical zone at the bottom of our land. And it's because of this edge that we are able to grow pretty much any fruit and vegetable in the world, because there's such diversity, because all of the elements are meeting at that point. And so, of course, we have to meet our own edges. And we have that same happening, that same process happening within ourselves. So the first step of that is to push ourselves beyond our comfort zone. And I mentioned that already as this indigenous saying, where the the excessive comfort makes us weak. We have to have challenges in our lives that allow us to evolve. So then how can we push our edges in order to find that diversity in ourselves, in order to discover that we are capable of a lot more than what we think that we are capable of? And then, of course, what we do within the edge and how we can engage in our lives without marginalizing anything, and really see how there is this evolution that is happening when we meet our edges, when all of the elements, right, when there is this challenge in our lives and we are able to fully engage with it, then all of our hidden reserves are activated. All of our potential is able to come to the forefront, and our ability to engage, to discover what is possible. So then, of course, when we are pushing our edges, we also become curious and open and receptive how other people are engaging with their challenges and with their edges. And then, of course, we also become more humble. Because if I'm in my comfort zone, then I can get very arrogant. I get to know all of the different ins and outs of my own very limited conditioned existence, and I'm not able to see beyond it. But when I meet my edges, when I actually get to my limit, then that can be very humbling, and then that can open me to the experience of others. So that's also very essential to keep facing ourselves. So and then, of course, also within the outer environment, where in our center we've had to face many challenges, both on the inner and outer levels, within our community, within the landscape, within the surrounding communities. And it has been extremely challenging at times. But at the same time, immense evolution has come from that. And also this deeper meaning, greater purpose, then allowed us to persevere, right? Because it's those moments of truth. What is happening? Why am I actually doing this? I'm facing this great challenge. And if I don't have real meaning and purpose in my life that is greater than myself, then I can give up very easily. And so those moments where we can really question ourselves, okay, I'm meeting this great challenge, but how can I really connect and collect all of my pieces together in service to that greater purpose? Because if there is no greater purpose, then I'm not able to collect myself together. So there is this shared heart, shared meaning, common ground that we all need in order to bring all of our qualities, all of our gifts and talents to the table so that we can share them. So for the indigenous people, they saw that to be the most essential, where we can live together in that way and recognize the higher meaning, the higher purpose of our lives. And through that, we can actually humbly share our highest potential with each other and support each other to do the same. So, and that actually allows everyone to unravel and discover their highest potential. And then we can all blossom and thrive. There's no reason why we can't do it. In nature, there is abundance. This scarcity mentality is a man-made concept. It's something that has come through the conditioning of our society. But if you look in nature, just how many fruit one tree can provide. On our land, we have lots of avocados, for example. It's an ancient avocado grove. And we have unlimited avocado supply throughout year round. And we have to wear even helmets sometimes because they're very big avocados. Yeah, this abundance that also encourages us to be safe and sober but there is this abundance in nature. And then how can we really apply that to our own life, this abundance of the heart, so that we can learn to share it with each other and the world, and then apply that to the outer circumstances. And the more that we share, the more that we have. And that's also an ancient principle. That's how life works. But otherwise, the scarcity mentality, then also it has that kind of multiplying effect, where the more that I try to get from the world, the less there is. So then whatever I see that is missing in the world, that's what I have to share. That's how the indigenous people approach that, at least in ancient times, before they were also infected with this modern mentality. And so then the final principle that I'll mention today, and then I'll open some space to questions and reflections. I don't know how much time we have. Okay, I think we are a little bit over. So then the final one is, of course, the creativity, the creatively use and respond to change, which all of those principles are pointing to. So again, it's this beginner's mind, flexibility versus rigidity. And it's this intelligence as the ability to adapt. I see somebody mentioned scarcity of time. Definitely this time is also a man-made concept that we have today with the clock. Indigenous people don't live by that time, and I have been hanging around indigenous people for the last 20 years, and it's also, I'm not so used to it, but I have to really live in the constraints of modern society and adapt myself and be flexible. So, but I just looked at it for the first time. I looked at the time throughout our conversation. So it's also part of the flexibility. Yeah, we do live in a conditioned existence, and how to bring unconditional love into this conditioned existence as well. That's also a very essential principle. It's not something that is excluded. Yeah, this world that we live in with all of its constraints and limitations, we have to bring love into that as well. And for the indigenous people, they also see wisdom in that, right? So all of the conditions, all of the limitations, in a way they become the womb for us to gestate that seed of our potential. And without all the constraints, we don't learn how to be patient. We don't learn how to really stay with our challenges and be present with our problems. So that is all an essential part of that. So that is a little overview. And of course, I just dipped the toes in the water, so to speak. I just briefly touched upon it. It's a vast science. The indigenous people refer to it sometimes as the sacred science, and it applies to every aspect of our life, from healing our illnesses on a physical level to healing our spirit, and also healing our environment, healing our communities, our relationship with each other. So there is a lot to that. And it's something that it's up to each one of us to keep contemplating, to keep cultivating, and really seeing how we can continue to awaken ourselves and see that there are many, many layers of meaning to these permaculture principles and how they are related to the ancestral wisdom and the heritage of humanity, that it's up to us to really cultivate and apply and make a difference, right? We are the change that we have been waiting for. And in my experience and the teachings of our elders here, it has to start from within. And then it's this critical mass consciousness that can really make a difference in the world. It's not the politics and not the politicians and not fighting against the current system or paradigm, but creating positive examples. That's how the real change has been made throughout human history. Ignorance is just basically not knowing any better. So as soon as there is a viable example that people can see them naturally, then that creates a difference and a change. And it's up to us to really cultivate and implement that on an individual level that then can really overflow into the collective, right? So it's also based on that permaculture principle of captivating energy that can then overflow. So this is a little overview, and I'm grateful for everyone to participate and for your attention span in this. And then we'll have some time. I'm not sure if we still do it here, Terry and Amy, or if we go into the Facebook group where people can share some questions and answers.
Roman, thank you so much for having such an open heart and sharing it with us. You have done an amazing job at demonstrating how the inner world truly manifests and affects the outer world. And your expertise in these decades of work you've done is just such a relief to see. And every time I speak with you, I feel inspired and I feel hopeful. And that is a gift that you have, my friend. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. I do have a few questions that I would love to, since I have you here, I'm going to go ahead and ask you questions. And
yeah, go ahead.
One of the concepts you spoke of that really caught me deeply was that excess comfort creates weakness. And this is something I struggle with all the time because I'm trying to constantly reduce my footprint, but at the cost of maybe losing my stability. So where do you find, because here you're in the jungles of Peru, I imagine you are living much less comforted than the majority of, say, Americans or developed nations. Where do you find that balance manifesting in the material? What do you do without, and how do you deal with the challenges in life?
Thank you, Terry. Well, I find that there has to be a balance, right? Where also it's essential to recognize how we can engage with the comforts of today's world so that we don't become stagnant. Because everything can be either poison or medicine, depending on how we approach it, depending on our attitude. And so the comforts also in themselves, they are not bad. But of course, if we engage in those comforts in a way that creates stagnation and indulgence in our lives, then that is not beneficial. And so then I find that it's essential to have balance where it's excessive comfort that makes us weak. It's not that there has to be no comfort, because then, in my experience, that also doesn't allow for meaningful reflection and insight. So there has to be some comfort for the indigenous people as well. It's not like they're totally feral and don't have roof over their head, and they have to like hide between rocks. So yeah, there has to be some level of comfort, but not too much, right?
I like
for us to engage meaningfully in life.
Thank you.
Yeah, I find that it's a life that is not based on extremes, right? It's this middle way where it's not completely uncomfortable and it's not completely comfortable, and there is a healthy balance. And so I have a family with kids, and the kids are not able to kind of, at this point, they're very small. One is 4 years old, another one is 8 months old. And they have to have, for the kids especially, they need to have this comfortable nest that is stable until they're able to go into more challenging world and environment, and it's for all children. And so we have a house in the Sacred Valley where it's kind of more of this connection to the Western civilization while still being immersed in nature. And then we have our 4,000 acre reserve that is more distant, that is at the edge of the Andean Mountains, and it's more off the grid and more challenging environment there. And so I find that it's been very healthy to have that balance where I spend part of the time there, part of the time here. It's been more challenging for me since my kids have been born because I need to be more with them. But still, I find so much meaning in the contrast, right? It's this contrast that allows life to be meaningful and also allows greater objectivity and perspective. Where if there are extremes, then it's much more difficult. So again, it's this edge where life meets.
Beautiful. Thank you for taking the time to really explain that in a concrete example. I've always been really impressed by the work you do with healing people, both of physical illness and the inner landscape shaping that you do. And you've brought in a concept to me that I never really thought of, and that was shamanic permaculture. And could you spend just a couple minutes explaining what you believe shamanic permaculture could be defined as, and what are examples of that?
Well, I've been sharing it throughout this talk, but the shamanic permaculture again relates to this. The indigenous people that I've worked with, both in the Amazon rainforest, I worked with several tribes, and also the Mestizo people, and also here in the Andes, working with Quechua people, and also with the Cairo nation. And right now we are planning an expedition to provide essential food supply because they've been really hard hit with this epidemic here in Peru. And for the indigenous people, the healers, the shamans, so to speak, they're often related to in their language as the curious ones. That's their basic perspective, that the healers, they have to be curious. Healing is about curiosity, is about receptivity, and again, connecting those dots. And the shamanic permaculture, as it relates to the inner landscape, has to do with establishing proper landmarks within our inner landscape. So scouting the territory, getting to know the terrain of our inner world and mapping it out, creating the design, right? In the same way as the permaculture. Okay, what is the zone 0.00? And how can I cultivate the essential food for thought in my immediate environment and the farther environment? What are the energies that I'm dealing with? How can I harness those energies and deal with them? All those disturbing emotions in my life, it's energy. I make it disturbing because I never learned how to deal with it, and then it becomes destructive. But then how can I really work with that? So I have to map it out. I have to create a design for the inner landscape and the way that I engage with it. So then all of those principles are applied in the way that I live my life. So last year, we've been able to bring all of that together and create an evolutionary blueprint course online that is based on those principles and the indigenous way of cultivating that inner terrain, understanding the language of the soul, the language of nature, in a way that it is actually communicating to us through every experience of our life, all the people that we've ever met, all of the situations that we've gone through, and how there is this heroic journey that we've been going through in our lives to return into the source of creative potential, to tap into that highest potential of our lives. So at first, we are born from unconditional love, where we are totally blind to it. We are in the dark, in the darkness of the mother's womb, and we are receiving everything without being aware of it. But we know that there is this unconditional love that is so essential for our existence. And then through our evolutionary journey, at first we're just consumers of that, but then we have to learn how to generate it, how to channel it through our being, how to amplify it. And there is this heroic journey that has to do with realization. In these traditions, it's not a path of accomplishment. It's not a path of personal development. It's a path of realization. We already have all of those ingredients, but then it's up to us to bring them together and to create this perfect recipe for unconditional love to flow through us, to be available from us. So in the Cairo tradition, they call it the mastery of love. They call it this journey of remembrance, where we consciously remember how initially we receive it all from the external circumstances, but the external circumstances, they are a mirror to the nature within us. And then gradually we are able to connect and tap into all of those elements and what they mean, all of those essential qualities that we are born with without realizing. And then the more that we realize it, the more that we are able to actually be a full embodiment of nature. So that's the approach that we engage with.
You are such a beautiful soul, Roman. Thank you so much for spending the time and opening your heart to us. Can you please tell us how to get in touch with the work you're doing and maybe how to take one of these courses?
Sure. Well, our website is paititi-institute.org, and we have all the courses described there. There's Evolutionary Blueprint course. We have our permaculture, Shamanic Permaculture course coming in November. I think I'm not so good with the kind of physical time schedule. My wife, she is more responsible for that. But you'll see all the details on our site. And our teacher, Andrew Jones, he's joining us in November. Hopefully then everything will be supportive of that in the world. And I really look forward, and I really love also the work that you do, Terry. And I visited your farm in Florida. It was also very inspiring, and also continue to follow your work, and also the Kashu Institute.
Kashi.
Kashi. Yeah, so I really look forward to continue collaborating and also sharing the work that you're doing. And I really appreciate the pure intentions and the connection to the meaning and the work that you're engaging with. And so yeah, it takes, we all do our part. And so I'm also very grateful and really look forward to our continuing friendship and working side by side with each other, with everyone here. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad to be part of this interconnected journey with you, Roman. Thank you so much for your time and all that you do. So we're going to move this conversation on to our Facebook page, and please come ask questions. This is such an important topic and honestly one of the best places to start the permaculture journey. And it's never a bad time to go back to it, because that which we manifest, if we're coming from a place of disconnection and the lack of peace, the gardens and the systems that we manifest will reflect that. So it's such a wonderful, wonderful field to dive into deeply. We'd love to meet you in the Facebook group and talk about your biggest takeaway from the class and continue this conversation. I want to thank Amy Zelt for producing our program here, making sure everything runs smoothly. And of course, thank you, Roman and Cynthia and the Paititi Institute for just existing and doing the work you do. I want to thank everybody for being on the call. We wouldn't be here without you, without your donations, without your support, and of course, without your interest. In the gardens, we make space for things. We create beautiful containers and we design beautiful, beautiful gardens. And this all comes from making space for them. And I feel it is our obligation, is our duty to learn from our ancestors. Permaculture is an indigenous practice. It comes from all these centuries of information and wonderful knowledge. And we have to make space for that knowledge as we move forward into an abundant future together. So thank you everyone for being part of this work, and thank you for being here. I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye everyone. I love you all.
Thank you everyone. Much love.